Good evening. I'm Charles Powell. Welcome to another edition of Religion in 60 Minutes, hosted by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and co-sponsored by the Initiative on Race and Resilience at the University of Notre Dame and the Civil Rights Heritage Center of South Bend. In September of 2020, a firestorm of controversy broke out across America. In his new book, The Chief's Chief, Senator Meadows, former White House Chief of Staff, writes that his old boss, President Donald Trump, was inspired several times by the Tucker Carlson show. He writes, on September the 2nd, sitting in his private office off the Oval around 9:30 p.m., President Trump saw an interview on Tucker Carlson Tonight with a journalist named Christopher Rufo. Rufo, a former documentary filmmaker turned activist, has been behind much of the recent nationwide push among Republicans, targeting how racism is taught in schools and seeking to minimize racial sensitivity training among employers. Meadows goes on to describe how the Trump White House took notes right from Carlson's show and turned them into executive action. Needless to say, over the past year and a half, critical race theory has become a hotly contested issue, as parents particularly have debated how race is taught in schools. These conversations have raised important questions. Number one on the list, what precisely is critical race theory? Why has it caused tensions between some Christians? Why do some faith practitioners think the term is problematic? Is it possible to reasonably disagree, or are some perspectives morally unacceptable? And how might people of faith work together to address racism in America and work toward a more equitable and inclusive democracy? In our panel discussion today, we will explore these important civic issues through the lens of practical theology. In a thoughtful atmosphere of mutual respect, and hopefully we will gain insights into how do we bring about genuine change in a real world, change that promotes the integral human development of all people. I am joined by the Reverend Tiffany Williams Brewer, a former judge and law professor. Reverend Brewer is an author, writer, speaker, trainer, and consultant internationally throughout 3 continents. She is the founder and CEO of the Esther Project and pastor of Transformed Church Global Ministries. Reverend Williams Brewer, welcome to the conversation.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here tonight and to have this very important conversation. And I thank you again, my friend, for inviting me. Looking forward to it.
Indeed. I am also joined by Dr. Neil Shenvi. He is a graduate of Princeton and UC Berkeley. He was a postdoctoral associate at Yale and taught chemistry at Duke University. Since 2015, he has been devoting much of his time to Christian apologetics. He is a member of the Summit Church in Durham, North Carolina, where the former Southern Baptist Convention President J.D. Greer pastors. Dr. Shenvi, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Reverend Williams Brewer for being on this panel with me.
I want to preface this conversation this evening by noting that the University of Notre Dame recently launched the Initiative on Race and Resilience, a new interdisciplinary program focused on the redress of systemic racism and the support of communities of color, both within and beyond the Notre Dame campus. Led by the College of Arts and Letters with additional support from the Office of the Provost, the initiative brings together scholars and students in the humanities, arts, social sciences, and other disciplines to challenge systemic racism and promote racial equality through research, education, and community empowerment. The director of the initiative, Mark A. Sanders, says, our university mission calls on us to assist the world to create justice grounded in love. And so we have a unique responsibility to support the study of race and to amplify the voices, gifts, and talents of people of color. Moreover, this initiative marks the creation of a think tank on race, an intellectual and physical space at Notre Dame where people will come together to address issues of race and racism, both systemic and interpersonal. So, what is critical race theory? Those who are familiar with the topic know that Professor Derek Bell and several other American legal scholars, including Alan Freeman, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Cheryl Harris, Charles R. Lawrence III, and others began using the phrase critical race theory, also known as CRT, in the 1970s as a takeoff on critical legal theory, a branch of legal scholarship that challenges the validity of concepts such as rationality, objective truth, and judicial neutrality. According to the American Bar Association, CRT is a verb, it is not a noun, and it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation. Moreover, CRT does not define racism in the traditional manner as solely the consequence of discrete, irrational, bad acts perpetrated by individuals, but is usually the unintended but often foreseeable consequence of broader patterns in society. It exposes the way that racism is cloaked in terminology regarding mainstream, normal, or traditional values or neutral policies, principles, or practices. And as scholar Tara Yosso asserts, CRT can be an approach used to theorize, examine, and challenge the ways in which race and racism implicitly and explicitly impact social structures, practices, and discourses. CRT observes that scholarship that ignores race is not demonstrating neutrality, but adherence to the existing racial hierarchy. As of August 2021, 8 states have banned CRT from being taught in the classroom. 15 more states are considering a ban of CRT. Christianity Today recently said, with hysteria and misinformation swirling all around it, critical race theory has become nearly impossible to discuss without stirring up ideological fears and partisan divisions. Yet many believe its ideas must be responded to if the church is ever going to take seriously issues of diversity, justice, and racial reconciliation. So, without further ado, let's engage in the conversation and hopefully inspire our communities to work towards a more equitable and inclusive democracy. Using the descriptive empirical task, the question is raised, what is going on? Historically, 2020 is known as a year of civil unrest in the United States. Examples included the murder of George Floyd, summer of protest, police brutality, inequality, and racism. I want you both to speak to the current conversation that is taking place on CRT in your respective communities. What is going on? I don't want you to tell me why it isn't going. I don't want you to tell me why is it going on. We'll get to that in a few moments, but tell me why. Tell me what rather is going on in your state. What is going on with your boards of education? What is going on in your church community? Set the scene for us. Reverend Tiffany, you have a very unique perspective. You were a former judge in New Jersey, professor of law and public policy, and now you are a pastor. You have to address this on a weekly basis. What is going on?
Well, again, thank you for having me for this important discussion, because what is going on is a reckoning of race and about race and racial identity and the impact that race has on the systems of our world and our society, particularly in America, where we have the unique legacy of having engaged in slavery and having descendants of slaves here in the United States integrated into society. That is a unique position that we have in the world when we look at historically our grappling of race in the United States. So it's important for me to root what's going on in the unique history of the United States. So what is going on in my state of New Jersey? We are not one of those states that is likely on a statewide level to issue any public policy that would be banning CRT because, in New Jersey, from a public policy perspective, there is an embracing of the fact that we are one of the most diverse states in the United States and have many of the largest ethnic populations that exist, in the United States, right here in pockets of New Jersey. However, you address boards of education. However, there are some splits locally. And you don't want us to talk about why, but there is somewhat of a pattern that I am seeing that communities that seem to be divided politically seem to also be reacting to the bans that are out there and grappling. So I think I see from a public policy perspective on the education level, a grappling and a desire to grapple with whether CRT is something that is valuable in certain boards of education, or if it's something that will be harmful to children. I'll certainly give my views on that as we progress. And finally, in the church community, we are confronting racial reckoning as well, and the relevancy of how we frame the conversation about race, inclusivity, transfer of power, who is oppressed, and whether the systems of our government also have baked within them oppression. The church community is looking to be relevant today and to be partners with the rest of society. Faith-based partners are important constituencies in making public policy and in holding public policy makers accountable. So I do see in the local church community the desire in both the Black church community and those Christians who want to be allies as well. They want to move forward and use the call of Christ to further racial justice and racial healing in our country.
Thank you. Dr. Shenvi, you are engaged with the evangelical community in the United States. You speak in churches, colleges, and seminaries. Tell us, what is going on in the evangelical community?
Sure. So like our culture, I agree with Reverend Williams Brewer that we're really seeing a lot of interest and concern about race and racism in the last year, 2 years, even 5 or 10 years, I'd say. The question I think we need to engage with as Christians and as evangelicals is critical race theory the way we want to frame this conversation? So for example, last year after the murder of George Floyd, the Smithsonian Institute, their National Museum of African American History and Culture, put out an infographic about the aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. And on it, they listed objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, and ideas like hard work is the key to success as elements of a whiteness. And people were aghast, thinking that is incredibly racist. That sounds like a neo-Nazi manifesto. Where is this idea coming from? And it turns out that you can trace many of these ideas back to critical race theory, which again originated in legal field, but has grown since then. So don't take my word for it. Kimberly Crenshaw this year, actually in August, wrote a document called Truth Be Told, where she said that professional educators and activists, quote, in a host of settings, including K through 12 teachers, have applied CRT to help recognize and eliminate systemic racism. And she elsewhere in 2002, she wrote that CRT is a label that basically is synonymous today. It's used interchangeably for race scholarship, just like Kleenex is used for facial tissue. So the question is not the label we use to describe this set of ideas, it's the ideas themselves that are, I think, problematic, that we actually want to steer away from if we really want to seek justice and unity. And so in my state of North Carolina, what are we seeing in my state, for example? Well, in June 2021, the North Carolina State of Education, the Board of Education, passed a resolution saying, quote, there's an imperative duty to construct anti-racist systems, and said they're embracing equity as their framework. They're going to review and revise their policies using an equity lens. Now, why would that matter? Well, those terms mean something. So, for example, if you read the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, he says this: if discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. So in response to statements like that from the Board of Education that they want to be anti-racist, obviously many people were concerned. Are we going to reintroduce racial discrimination as an official policy? And so in response, the North Carolina legislature introduced a bill that said things like schools shall not promote the idea, one, that one race is inherently superior to another race, that things like individuals should not be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race. So they phrased it very carefully to say, we don't want to just label a term as bad. We want to address these ideas and say, we don't want our public kids being taught that, for example, one race is superior, or that we should discriminate against someone on the basis of race alone. And I think it's very important to emphasize that Senator Phil Berger, who introduced this resolution, said explicitly in a speech, children must learn about our state's racial past and all of its ugliness, including the cruelty of slavery, to the 1898 Wilmington Race Massacre, to Jim Crow. So he's not trying to downplay or ignore history. He's simply saying that we don't want to reintroduce discrimination into our public school system. And finally, locally in our churches, we're seeing the same tension arise. SVC pastor Kevin Briggs is a Black pastor, and he wrote an essay entitled, "We're Really Not Making This Up, a personal tale about CRT's impact on his own church." And he said he noticed a shift in worldview with the woke crowd. This is his direct quote. They were using language in a way that we weren't familiar with. The terms of whiteness, blackness, white supremacy, oppressed, privilege, fragility, hegemonic power filled their vocabulary. And he said, quote, "I began to speak up against it because I've seen how destructive it is. I don't believe it brings us any closer to justice or unity." So it's happening in my neck of the woods, and I think we're seeing similar things happening all over the country.
Thank you. Well articulated by both of you. Using the interpretive task of practical theological interpretation, I want to ask now, why is it going on? Dr. Shenvi, why do you think there is such pushback from many within the evangelical church on CRT? You know as well as I do, leaders such as John MacArthur, Albert Mohler, Tom Askell, and more have been very critical of CRT. I have heard them say that CRT ideologies are rooted in neo-Marxism, that is, that churches, prisons, schools, etc., continue to divide the powerful from the powerless. And then there are postmodern worldviews to consider. That is, they are suspect at best of established power. Moreover, many white evangelicals state that difficulties within the larger Black community are due to a lack of individual initiative and has very little to do with systemic racism, and that whites bore neither guilt nor responsibility for them. Can you unpack some of this for us?
Sure. So there are many different reasons I think people push back against CRT. One, it can be that they don't really know what's being taught. They could just hear the term and say, I'm against it. I don't know what it's about. And I would urge people to really look into it, read the primary sources to get a handle on what these ideas actually are saying. As to other criticism, I think, well, CRT does draw on neo-Marxism and postmodern ideologies. For example, in their book, CRT: An Introduction, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik say this on page 5: CRT draws from certain European philosophers and theorists, such as Antonio Gramsci, the father of neo-Marxism, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Derrida, two very famous postmodern scholars. So it's true that, and in Terry Yasso's essay, Whose Culture is Capital, she has a figure labeled Intellectual Genealogy of CRT, and right above it, it lists Marxism and neo-Marxism and feminisms as precursors to CRT. So it does emerge out of these schools of thought, and yet I want to focus on the ideas themselves, not just on the genealogy, because obviously you'd say, well, chemistry comes from alchemy, and I reject alchemy, so therefore I should reject chemistry. Well, that's not exactly right. So a better objection is that these ideas being taught are actually the problem, not the label, not the genealogy. So for example, we are seeing the penetration of these ideas into evangelicalism in a very dangerous and bad way. For example, in an essay entitled "The End of Mission," Andrew Draper writes this in a book called "Can White People Be Saved?" He writes, "Whiteness is best understood as a religious system of pagan idol worship. As idolatry, whiteness must be dealt with like any such cultic system. Its high places must be torn down and its altars laid low." And he says that if we are going to be reconciled to God, we must have a deconversion from whiteness. Now, he's not using whiteness to describe our skin color here. He's using it to describe an ideology. But the point is, you can see how that kind of setup that classifies some people as inherently immersed in this oppressive ideology due to their social location, that's going to run up against Christian ideas of the unity of the church, our brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ. And elsewhere, you could list people like Robert Jones, who view the anti-racist project as encompassing this deconstruction of doctrines like biblical inerrancy, marriage and family. He writes, what if, for example, we're so immersed in white supremacy as white Christians? He says, what if conceptions of marriage and family, the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the idea the Bible is inerrant without error and authoritative, or even the concept of having a personal relationship with Jesus developed as they did because they were useful tools for reinforcing white dominance? So you can see that once you adopt this framework that sees our whole history, our whole theology, our whole social life as tainted with white privilege and white supremacy, you begin to dismantle a lot of doctrines that Christians, all Christians, recognize are very important. Whether we're white or black or half Indian, as in my case, we want to hold on to what's true and good and not just reject it as an element of whiteness.
Thank you. Reverend Williams Brewer, let's pick up on this just a bit. You may be very familiar with this new book that has recently come out, Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black America. It was written by Columbia University professor John McWhorter, who is an African American. And he says that he is concerned that this new alertness to racism in America, especially CRT, is, in his words, condescending to Black people. He writes that some Black people have innocently fallen under the misimpression that for us only, cries of weakness constitute a kind of strength, and that for us only, what makes us interesting, what makes us matter, is a curated persona as eternally victimized souls, ever carrying and defined by the memories and the injuries of our people across the 4 centuries behind us, ever unrecognized, ever misunderstood, ever in a sordid census unpaid. You believe that there are many positive virtues of CRT, and I would like for you to speak to these virtues. Additionally, why, in your opinion, have so many Black Americans and minorities embraced CRT as quickly as they have? And do you have any particular concerns with woke or alert racism in America?
Well, let me first just disavow, since you started with that quote from that particular author, I will certainly disavow that I agree with that at all. And I do believe that both some of the critiques of CRT that we've heard, as well as that statement, really demonstrate why we need CRT. And first of all, I still don't think that the average American understands what critical race theory is. I don't think a lot of our public policymakers that are advocating even for bans understand what it is, because it is a way of thinking. It is about critical analysis. There is not one person, one author, one scholar who truly owns CRT, because it is not, as you said in the beginning, Dr. Powell, it's not a noun, it's a verb. It is a way of thinking. We don't ban thought. in the United States of America. So in fact, and as public policymakers, we typically don't just read a book or watch a television show or see a news article and go back to our desk and just issue public policy mandates. And similarly, as pastors, we don't get up in our pulpits responsibly and criticize ways of thinking because we may not understand even the words that are being used by others. So one reason why I think critical race theory and discussion about it is important is because it's forcing us as Christians and as thought leaders that we should be as Christians in society to think critically, not only to think critically about the role of race in America, but to think critically about truth. So let's talk about Jesus, since we're talking about the Christian perspective, because as Christians, that is who we should really be filtering our thoughts by. So as we're looking at critical race theory and evaluating it, we can certainly critique what others have said about it in books and so forth, but we should be thinking critically about what would Jesus say about critical race theory? How does critical race theory, this way of thinking about race in America, square with what Jesus was about? Jesus was first all about truth and liberty. He had a passion for the oppressed. Critical race theory challenges us to look at the oppressed and the constructs of race. We have embedded in our society, in our laws, in the highest institutions in our land, including the US Supreme Court and the United States Congress, which are institutions that form our democracy, we have engaged in racist public policies. And we have a legacy to deal with in the United States. And we cannot ignore that. That's inconsistent with the truth. It is true that in schools, and coming from even our own president of the United States at different times in history, that there was an elevation of one race being superior to another. And so we are dealing with the dismantling of that. We've only moved forward in our society away from this Blacks are inferior mentality and public policy making because people have thought critically about the role of race in America and its legacy. As Christians, going back to what would Jesus think about this concept of thinking deeper about race in America. Not only was he about truth and freedom for the oppressed, and we know that there are oppressive policies, and historically there have been oppressive policies that we're still dealing with in the United States. Christ was about love, agape, and grace. You know, his mission was about revelation of truth. It was about social activism as well. We recall the life of Christ was one in which he challenged the religious establishment. His very essence was a challenge to the status quo. He was a critical thinker. So race was not the construct of his time, but it was religion and it was religious thought. And so his own propitiatory death really even challenged the notion of justice and salvation, that it wasn't just for one group of people, but it was for Jews and Gentiles. So that is consistent with a doctrine or a theory that we have in the world of challenging our minds to think critically about the impact of race. So I don't think that as public policymakers, as Christians, as pastors, that we should view critical race theory as this one thing that can be quoted in a book and ascribed to and has a doctrine in and of itself. It is a challenge for us to be truthful about the impact that race has had. And you did ask me, Dr. Powell, about Black Americans in particular, but let me also say that critical race theory is not just about racial justice for African Americans. We do have a unique history, culture, and relationship in the United States, but there are other minorities in our country that we should be thinking critically about the role that race plays, certainly Native Americans. That's why there are many controversies going now about the relevance of Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, and is an affront. You know, a local school, we started with what's going on. The town I live in had a tremendous dispute about whether Columbus Day would still be called Columbus Day, and the Italian American community was affronted that a Columbus Day would not be recognized. And so it started these conversations about race and how we look at history. So I don't think the answer is, I don't think you are elevating one race over the other at all. That is antithetical to critical race theory. But we have to look at racial superiority, because that's why we need critical race theory, because racial superiority and white supremacy is baked into American culture, not just culture, into the legal systems. And I'll wrap up by saying critical race theory came about by legal scholars who, and I'm a part of the Legal Academy, and we look at the system of laws to analyze how we should be looking at reform, and to come up with this concept of looking at the legal system to analyze the impact of race is one that we have to do if we say we are Americans. You know, Kimberly Crenshaw also said that when she started talking about this concept of critical race theory, she said she wanted to be critical. She wanted to talk about race, and she added the word theory to signify that they weren't just looking at civil rights practice. So this is how these words kind of came together. But she wanted to think about how to read and grapple with how the law created and sustained race and racism in American society. And she sees her work as talking back. So, and talking back to mainstream kind of power structure. And that is the essence of what Jesus Christ did when he walked the earth. He talked back to the power structure. And so I do think there are positives in critical race theory, and I think that we have to be very careful about in our critiques and criticism as pastors, whether we are truly using the Bible and the walk of Jesus Christ as our filter as to whether critical race theory is positive.
Thank you. So at this point, we have briefly talked about what is going on, and understand we are only on the surface here. We have talked about why it is going on. And now I'd like for us to turn to the normative task of practical theological interpretation. And I want to ask you both what should be going on. And I understand you do not necessarily speak for the wholeness of your community, but we do want to hear from your experiences, from your understanding, from your knowledge of critical race theory. Let's consider the theological and ethical interpretations of this conversation. In a recent article titled "Critical Race Theory Conflicts with Christian Worldview" by John Stonestreet and Timothy D. Paget in Breakpoint, they wrote the following: critical race theory can be considered a worldview. It does more than just offer a handful of specific ideas about race and society. CRT offers a complete framework of beliefs, a complete framework, a universalizing story of the world. CRT describes who we are, what's wrong with the world, and prescribes how to fix it and what better would be. In other words, like Christianity, they argue that CRT answers the basic questions any worldview does, except the answers CRT provides are very different from those of Christianity, even if both worldviews recognize the world is broken by evils such as racism and injustice. So, Dr. Shenvi and Reverend Williams Brewer, what do you see as a theological and ethical response to systemic racism, especially as it relates to teaching CRT in school? Dr. Shenvi, you have the floor.
Sure. So one of the earliest works to sort of formalize critical race theory is a book called Words That Wound, written by Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, Richard Delgado, and Charles Lawrence. These are four titans in critical race theory, for founders. And they list the defining elements of CRT, these 6 ideas that are foundational to something being CRT. And to show you that it really is functioning as a worldview for many people today, here's just number 6. They list this as a defining element. They write, critical race theory works toward the end of eliminating racial oppression as part of a broader goal of ending all forms of oppression, because oppressions experienced in tandem, racial oppressions experienced in tandem with other oppressions on the grounds of gender, class, or sexual orientation. So they want to seek fundamental social transformation, and not just to seek adjustments within established hierarchies, but they want to challenge hierarchy itself. Now, elsewhere, Crenshaw writes things about how they want to dismantle patriarchy, heterosexism, and class stratification. Kiara Bridges, in her book CRT a Primer, she's a critical race theorist at Berkeley, says CRT insists that one cannot understand the inequalities within society if one fails to understand classism, sexism, religious intolerance, homophobia, transphobia, etc. So you kind of can see how it's speaking to more than just race narrowly. It's speaking to sexuality, gender, class, justice itself, oppression itself. So you see how it begins to function as a worldview. And I think that's why many Christians are concerned. They're seeing people adopt this worldview that has very different answers to questions like, who am I? What is moral and immoral? What is permissible sexual ethics? What is a good way to think about my gender? So for that reason, I think that we need to right up front say, here is exactly, precisely where CRT conflicts with a Christian view of these questions of identity, justice, oppression, etc. Another example is even narrowly defined in terms of how it views the law. Critical race theory denies that law, human law, ought to be an expression or a manifestation of God's divine law. For example, Professor Tommy Curry, in an essay called Shut Your Mouth, he writes this: in contemporary critical race theory, it is largely agreed that what we know as the law is nothing more than politics and not a moral order ordained by God, in parentheses, natural law. Now, contrast his statement with Martin Luther King Jr.'s reasoning in his letter from a Birmingham jail. There, he channels Thomas Aquinas, who argued that a just human law is one that's in accord with God's divine, moral, universal law. That's how Christians throughout history have understood human law. Of course, human law can be unjust. Of course, it can be evil, oppressive. But law is not merely a mechanism for justifying white supremacy. It's more than that. At critical race theory would really unearth and suggest that law just is a mechanism for domination. And Christians have to just reject that. In terms of how we approach systemic racism, I'll just say that we should define it very carefully. So, again, I'm quoting Kendi a lot because he's so popular, but in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says that an anti-racist policy is one that moves us towards equality, racial equality. And a racist policy is, quote, any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. There's no in between. You're either racist or anti-racist. Every law is either promoting equity or protecting inequity. But because of that, you have to ask, well, how would you then view the right approach to, say, abolish the police? He would say, because Blacks are incarcerated more than whites, therefore the very existence of, say, the police or certain laws or standardized testing or any kind of policy, you only evaluate it through one lens. Does it produce or sustain inequality, or does it not? but I'm arguing there actually are just and good laws that actually can still perpetuate inequalities. For example, private property. It's very important that we have private property. It's a good thing that people can own their own objects, houses, they can provide for their children, they can pass on an inheritance. But there's a tremendous and regrettable racial wealth gap. Black families, the median Black family has 13 times less wealth than the median white family. That's partly certainly due to the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, etc. But that said, does it therefore follow that we ought to abolish private property as an anti-racist policy? And that if we retain private property laws, that's a racist policy because it perpetuates inequity. I think it's simply a simplistic and wrong way to think about law. What we want to seek is laws that are just because they're grounded in God's law, in God's will for us, and not simply apply the singular lens of power to dismantle all laws that in any way contribute to inequity. So I would just say define it carefully. And I do want to think critically about laws and about race, but I think we shouldn't think simplistically. Often these inequities and inequalities are very complex in their origins and also in how we fix them. Lastly, I'll just say this. I do agree we want to bring a biblical lens to bear on how we think about justice and responsibility. I think here we want to move away from assigning blame to taking responsibility. So they're different things. In Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a great example. The man fell among thieves and was injured, and the Good Samaritan came by and saw him. Now, was he guilty for the man's state? No, he wasn't guilty. He didn't hurt that man. He didn't rob him. And yet he loved his neighbor as himself. He showed compassion. And Jesus calls us not to take the blame that we're not due. We didn't murder the man. We didn't hurt the man. We didn't contribute to his case. But Jesus says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall still bear responsibility to care for your neighbor, right? In reverence for God. So I think we can both avoid the problem of blaming people for things they didn't do, and also not fall into the trap of refusing to take care of our brothers and sisters, right? We owe that to God and to one another as members of one human family.
So thank you. We have about 10 more minutes before we take questions and answers from our online audience as well as from our live audience here. But I'd like to give Reverend William Brewer a chance now to respond to this theological and ethical response to systemic racism.
Thank you. And unequivocally, I believe that as Christians, we do have an obligation ethically to respond. We don't have the luxury to just sit by, and we also have an obligation as Christians to be educated. To not just find ourselves listening to things on television, to not just pick out a few books and read what someone has to say about critical race theory, whether it's saying that it's something positive or negative. But we have to also pray and be authentic in our own walk with Christ. And I do believe that responsibility ethically and theologically as a Christian means that we are truthful about wrongs that have been done. So I'm not talking about a wrong, because we do believe in grace. So we don't have to worry about nitpicking everything someone does against us in a day. But where we see human atrocities happening in society that have had impacts on others in society, when we see that laws have been passed, public policies are being contemplated that are unjust because they are meant really to be cloaked in assigning power and to remove power from others. As Christians, we should respond because that is unjust and inconsistent with who Christ was and who we are as his followers. So we have to stand up and be truthful. In South Africa, one of the first things after apartheid fell that helped that nation to move forward were these truth and reconciliation committees. And a part of what made that so powerful, and we can say the same thing even in Germany as well, there is a truth and yes, an assigning of blame for human atrocity that helps victims to move forward and helps to hold accountable those who were the perpetrators, but more importantly, it helps us to reflect on and put a benchmark and say, we will not go this way again. We understand the wrong and we acknowledge it, and we will not go this way again. Uniquely in American history, the atrocity of slavery, we have never done that in the United States. In fact, we had a civil war because we did not, as a nation, want to be unified. And there is a legacy that continues to perpetuate. So, as Christians, we have before us an example in our society of unjust policies that are a legacy of a sin in this country. And while we do not live in a theocratic society where we can reasonably, as Christians, expect that every single public policy that's passed is going to be consistent with the Bible, we should still, as a constituency, be lobbying for just laws. And when it comes to critical race theory and its mindset, that it helps us to analyze what is the truth. What is the reconciliation? Because Christ was about reconciliation. That is why he came. He reconciled the world that we could be one with him in eternity. So truth and reconciliation is key, and critical race theory is a mindset that can help you to get there. While you can make anything a worldview, capitalism is some people's worldview. But as Christians, our worldview should be rooted in biblical principles, and we do not have to completely ignore any value to CRT because others have used it as their worldview separate and apart from the Bible. But what I encourage us to be motivated as Christians and as those who are looking for theological and ethical, sources for moving forward, think about the fact that Jesus was all about tearing down oppression. CRT challenges us to look at our system of laws and to tear down, yes, those that even have a disparate impact on others. Even if they were not passed with racial animus, they can still be cast down if they have an impact that is discriminatory as well. And we should be seeking to rid ourselves of the stench of anything that would demonstrate that there is still vestiges of slavery baked and embedded in our system of laws in particular. That's my perspective, having been a public policy maker and involved in the legal system. I am most concerned about also professionally the ethical responsibility that I have as a lawyer to analyze our system of laws and its impact on society.
Very good. And I think that moves us right into the final official question that I have for you tonight. And that is using the pragmatic task of interpretation here. I want to ask you, what do we do about it? How do we create a narrative that is not binary? Why does it have to be either or? Is it the terminology that needs to be nuanced? You are both leaders within your communities. Both of you support human equality. When you speak, people listen. So can you both speak to transactional and transforming leadership? And I raise both of these leadership styles because there are trade-offs that have to be made along the way. And consequently, deep change requires true grit. How do we bring about genuine change, needed change in a real world? And I'll ask each of you to take just 2 minutes in closing here. And Dr. Shenvi, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I'll quickly just say, I really recommend dialogue. We need that more than anything else. And so one book that's great about this is Professor George Yancey's Beyond Racial Gridlock. He's a professor at Baylor. That's Yancey, not George Yancey, professor at Emory, who's also a race scholar, but George Yancey at Baylor is Beyond Racial Gridlock, because it recommends a dialogical approach to solving racial issues in the church and in society at large. Because I think a lot of us get very partisan and get very tribal, and especially in the church, we should show and display our unity in Christ. We need to find solutions that we all can live with, that we all buy into, and also that we all seek God's design and will in all these issues by sharpening one another, as iron sharpens iron. So dialogue is important. Defining your terms is important. Don't assume that everyone has the same definition of justice or oppression or identity, even within the church, so define them carefully. I don't focus on labels, so I don't care whether or not you want to use the term critical race theory or not. It's the ideas that matter. And so focus on ideas. Don't name call, don't label someone, write them off because they identify a certain way. Ask, what are the actual ideas on the table, and are they compatible with God's way of thinking about these issues? And finally, just that your church, you should be deeply invested in your local church as an outpost of and witness to God's kingdom. You know, Paul tells us that in the church, there's neither slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, male nor female, not because those identities don't exist, but because we have such a greater identity, a shared identity in Christ. And so the church should be the first place the world looks to see this love for one another across lines of race, class, and gender. That's what we should do. So I urge people to, at a local level, seek out people that disagree with you, talk to them as brothers, take them out for coffee, and work through these things as brothers and sisters in Christ.
Thank you. Reverend Williams Brewer.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and it's been wonderful having this conversation with you, Neil. And you brought up something that earlier I think is important in my answer. And my answer, Dr. Powell, would be a call to transformative leadership versus transactional leadership. And I think Jesus was the best example of transformative leadership. And Neil brought up the great commandment that was given, and Christ, really challenged us in his own walk to go beyond even the fact that we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, and mind. But he gave us another premise to that. He said to love your neighbor as yourself. How can we love our neighbor, first of all, if we don't know ourselves and we don't know our neighbor? If we truly believe that there is unity in the body of Christ, that means first we have to view ourselves as unified with our neighbor. And if you've lived a life and an experience that is so different than your neighbor, how can you truly know them and know what's best for them? And if you view yourself as a part of the universal body of Christ, then you will listen and dialogue, as Neil said, with your neighbor. You will look through eyes of compassion and understanding, not seeking to be understood, but seeking to understand your neighbor, and realizing that the more you understand your neighbor, the more you understand yourself. So I believe that this fits into our larger conversation about critical race theory, because the more you can challenge yourself as a Christian who may not view that you're impacted at all by critical race theory or by race, the more you can listen and understand the experiences of your neighbor, you'll understand more about you, and you'll be more effective in the kingdom of God, and will be able to work together to go out into the earth and fulfill the Great Commission, and to tear down just injustice where it stands. I'll leave with, I'm the founder of the Esther Project, so I have to mention Esther, Dr. Powell, but Esther was relevant for her time, and she used her influence to help the oppressed while she had personal power already. But she risked her personal and institutional power to use it to help the oppressed. And as a result, she saved lives literally, but more important, she found her own purpose. So I'll leave you with saying that we are called to do the same. And in finding your purpose and your relevancy here in the world as a Christian, you can use the concept of critical race theory to help bring about racial reconciliation and healing within the systems of our country and within the body of Christ.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left now, and we want to take some questions from the audience. And we have one here in the room. Is there a microphone that can be borrowed? Okay, we're getting the microphone to Dr. Mahan Mirza.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. You know, it's not always easy to get people to dialogue even on these issues today because they're so charged. So I'm very grateful. And I know there's going to be people out there who perhaps disagree with what's been said and want more. So I hope we can have more of this. I have a couple of questions. One is on the way that we talked about the relationship between critical race theory and Christianity, as if they're, one versus the other. But where, critical race theory has this one worldview where it breaks down hierarchies, and Christianity is a worldview that aspires to or maintains racial equality, but has still other kinds of hierarchies. And so my question is, can we think of it differently, that there's may also be a debate within Christianity and different kinds of Christianities? So one kind of Christianity is that is preserving a certain worldview, which has moved beyond racial hierarchy, but is maintaining other kinds of hierarchies. And another kind of Christianity that has moved beyond racial hierarchy and is also aspires to move beyond other hierarchies. So this is actually not a debate between critical race theory and Christianity, but within Christianity itself, which is not one thing, but a complex entity that continues to rediscover itself in every age. So that's one question. And then the second question is about discrimination. One of the points that was made that, in schools, we're replacing a discrimination that took place in the past with a new kind of discrimination, and instead we should treat everyone as individuals. And what that does is, in a way, it masks exactly what critical race theory is trying to bring to the fore, is that when you treat people as individuals, they come in having inherited from certain social conditions that they've inherited. And without acknowledging that, the people who come in with privilege, with early childhood education, with wealth in their homes, have a fundamental advantage over others who come in with being disadvantaged historically. And so my question is, are all kinds of discriminations bad? I mean, we discriminate. When you were speaking, I was thinking of this. We discriminate in the parking lot. We have handicapped parking. But that is a kind of discrimination that is good. We all would agree. And so are all discriminations bad? And is critical race theory inviting us to think of a discrimination to correct a historical wrong in a good way?
All right, thank you, Dr. Mahan Mirza, who is the executive director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. And I wonder, Dr. Shenvi, would you like to respond to one or both parts of his question?
Sure, I'll do both really briefly. One is that, yes, of course, you can make Christianity compatible with critical race theory and anything else if you modify how you define Christianity. But I would simply say that the idea, for example, that any kind of hierarchy exists is sort of inescapable in Christianity. For example, between God and his creatures, there's a hierarchy right there. And even within every historic branch of Christianity, idea of some kind of eldership or leaders or pastors and the congregations. And then obviously within evangelicalism, you have some sense of leadership within the family, within the church for men, which obviously is incredibly offensive to critical race theorists and many other people today. So yes, you can modify your theology, but I have to pleaded guilty to narrowly thinking about these questions in terms of what I believe the Bible teaches about all these doctrines, which I think is consistent with historic Protestant doctrine. And secondly, well, should we look at discrimination merely individually? And the excellent example of a handicapped parking where we do discriminate. And I actually use that example in some of my essays to point out that equity in that sense is not always wrong. And yet, for example, how it's applied by critical race theorists in education would be to say, in a sense, this might be a little offensive, but they would view being Black as that kind of handicap, in a sense that you'd treat Blacks as a group as if they are disadvantaged as a group. Now, that's a really basic question. Is that the right way to think about race? Is that we have to advantage people merely on the basis of their skin color or in some sense their social location, rather than on the basis of things that are actually visible? So for example, I would say I would want a family that is poor, regardless of their race, to be given consideration. For example, free and reduced lunches. That's not discrimination to give free lunches to poor families over rich families, but we have to draw the line somewhere. That's where the debate really lies, is what is a fair and just kind of consideration that doesn't cross the line into unfair and unjust discrimination. That's an open question, but I think one that CRT answers far too quickly. Thanks.
And we have time for really just one more question this evening. And I want to ask Reverend Williams Brewer if you would consider this particular question. One of our viewers sent in this question. The Reverend keeps mentioning the many examples of unjust policies and practices that are in effect and being contemplated, but has not mentioned one current law or policy that she is referencing. Can you give some specific examples? Do any come to mind?
Sure. I first want to recharacterize perhaps what the listener was hearing. I was referencing the type of policies that historically, I wasn't saying referencing in my remarks today about current day policies. That's a whole nother webinar. But for example, I was talking about how the Supreme Court, for example, has issued decisions. One that we can think of is Plessy versus Ferguson, furthering the concept of racial superiority of whites and inferiority of Blacks. The Korematsu decision, which shamefully allowed Japanese Americans to be interred in the United States. I was referencing also public policies that the United States Congress historically had issued as well. We've had the Chinese Exclusion Act. There have been numerous atrocities that have happened that have been baked and embedded into our legal institutions. And that's what I was referencing in particular. And just to the point of discrimination that came up in the last question, let me just also add that there's a difference between discrimination and difference. The word discrimination is a legal term of art, and it is how the law drew a line between which differences are wrong and which are not. Every difference is not discrimination. You will often hear in everyday parlance, individuals take this word discrimination and use it improperly. But discrimination is actually a legal term of art that does in and of itself indicate a line that has been drawn. And I will say that we should draw a line when we know historically that there have been people in society, like African Americans uniquely, who have been the legacy of both slavery and policies, public policies over centuries that have sought to reduce the status of African Americans, shift power away from them as well. And that is what critical race theory is having us to look at, and to look at what is even the history as to why we actually engage in policies that we engage in. And if it has a tie back to a discriminatory intent like Jim Crow laws, then let's change it and tear it down so we can move to a place in society where we can be treated as individuals. We cannot until we rectify and reconcile how people were mistreated and continue to feel the impact of it.
Thank you. Well, in the words of a practical theologian, which I am, change is messy. But in the words of Richard R. Osmer, this is a much needed reflective conversation that has to take place. And I hope we have many more conversations like this one in the near future. Reverend Williams Brewer and Dr. Shenvi, thank you for your participation in this panel discussion on CRT. Audience, thank you for joining us for another edition of Religion in 60 Minutes. And once again, thank you to our co-sponsors, the Initiative on Race and Resilience and the Civil Rights Heritage Center. The Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion is dedicated to the study of religion around the world and serves as a center of public deliberation and education through research, teaching, outreach, and interaction with religious communities and the public worldwide. Until next time, I'm Charles Powell. Good night.